Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. I'm very excited about the interview that I'm going to share with you today. The main topic is gut health, which gets a lot of attention in the media from both quacks and reputable sources. So my aim with this episode is to help you learn how to tell truth from myth. And I think that my guest, Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro, does a splendid job of explaining what we know and what we don't know about this topic. I invited her on the podcast because she has a PhD in the gut microbiome and metabolism. So she's done research in the lab on this very topic. In addition, she's been a full-time coach for a number of years, as well as a science communicator. So I believe that having experience both in the lab and coaching people in the real world, she can give us a fantastically nuanced perspective on this very complex topic. So without further ado, enjoy this interview. Gabrielle, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
It's going to be a pleasure to speak to you about gut health today. But before we start, can you tell the listeners who you are, what you do, and why you're so awesome at it?
So I'm Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro. I have my bachelor's in exercise science and my doctorate in skeletal muscle phys and biochem. And my dissertation focused on the relationship between the gut microbiome and metabolism. After I finished my doctorate, I went on to teach in exercise science for 4 years. And in my 4th year, I was hired by Renaissance Periodization to do nutrition coaching. And after a year of both teaching and coaching, I came to a crossroads where I really needed to decide which one I wanted to focus on. And higher ed had left me a bit disillusioned. So I decided to pursue coaching full time. And about a year into coaching for Renaissance Periodization, which was 100% email-based coaching, I also started my own business, Vitamin PhD Nutrition, which was initially intended to just be consultation-based. So I was providing people with evidence-based information about gut health. And I also started podcasting around that time. So I think 2017 might have been my first podcast focused on gut health. And from there, it seems like a snowball effect that I went from one podcast a month to a couple podcasts a month. And then all of a sudden it was like one a week. And then all of a sudden it was sometimes one a day because people were so hungry for more information about gut health. And I was one of very few people at the time, and might still be one of few people, although I know that number is growing, who has formal education in the area of gut microbiome or gastrointestinal health and is providing evidence-based content. So a lot of what I do now, having left RP a couple years ago and gone full-time into my own coaching business, I also started working as a science communicator and science journalist. So I write for examine.com and intermittently I write for barbend.com. And I also collaborate with other companies like Precision Nutrition to provide essentially translations of the microbiome literature into either understandable or applicable information. And I also worked with my good friend Shannon Beer to develop the comprehensive coaching framework, which is a way of integrating different techniques like motivational interviewing, which I should say is not a technique, but a way of being with someone, acceptance and commitment training, cognitive behavioral coaching, to help people flourish, which is essentially to do well in all domains of life. So, more than just looking at their physical health or their fitness level, I'm helping people to set boundaries so that they can improve both their relationships with themselves and with food, help to improve their body image flexibility, and essentially just help them live more authentically after they've come away from maybe years of chronic yo-yo dieting. So I would say I'm probably about 60% writing now and 40% coaching, but that oscillates based on the phase that I am in my career. And I would hope that I'm good at those things because I try to show up in a very empathetic and compassionate and understanding and accepting kind of way for people so that they feel safe sharing their journeys with me. And that when it comes to science communication, really the same principles are informing the way that I communicate. I don't want to call people out. I don't want to be demeaning. I want to provide the information in a way that validates a person's lived experience while also ensuring that they can make informed choices with accurate information.
Wow, thank you for that very detailed introduction. I think that's exact what you said at the end is the exact reason why I wanted you on the podcast, because I coach by those principles as well. I don't aim to call anyone out or criticize anyone, but I do want everybody who connects with me to be able to feel empowered in making choices and understanding the choice that they're making. So I think that having you here today to discuss this topic of gut health, which unfortunately attracts a lot of what I would call quackery, is
Yeah.
going to be really powerful for my listeners today. So, to start with, I usually like to get everyone on the same page with a definition. So, how would you define the concept of gut health?
I love that question, and it is going to be another bit of a lengthy answer. But it's lengthy because gut health, in and of itself, that term is not one that came from the research world, and it's not one that has a consensus definition. So, for example, if you wanted to look up the term gastrointestinal tract, or gut microbiome, or digestion, you would be able to find consensus definitions of those terms, but they kind of come together to form the idea or the concept of gut health. And the reason that it's important to come up with a working definition is that gut health can be used as a marketing term. It can be used in a way that is very misleading or fear mongery. And I just want to clarify that when I say the term gut health, I'm referring to three pretty specific aspects. And I call these the 3Ds of gut health. And this is, again, a definition that I've created, not one that comes from literature, but it's an answer that I needed to come up with because prior to this, I would say like gut health isn't actually a thing. And that's a very unsatisfying answer.
Yes.
so, so the 3Ds of gut health would be disease, digestion, and diversity. So, disease refers to either the absence or the management of a functional or organic disease of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, the GI tract, what I'm referring to, will include both the stomach and then the small and large intestines. So, a functional disease would be one in which the functionality of the digestive system is affected, but the tissues look normal. So, the most obvious example would be irritable bowel syndrome. So, the intestines, maybe due to dysregulated nervous system activity, maybe due to some role of the gut microbiome, aren't behaving normally. And that leads to a lot of discomfort. But if you were to take a look at the intestines, they would look like healthy, normal tissues. So that's a functional disease. An organic disease is one that affects both the tissues and the function. So an example would be inflammatory bowel disease. So if you were to take a look at the intestines, you would see that there are ulcers in the intestinal lining. And of course, that's going to affect the functionality of the intestines because that's going to interfere with absorption of nutrients, which is one of the primary roles of the GI tract. So when it comes to disease, it would be great if we could all be disease free, but that's not the case. And so I think it's important to include, ways that we can find successful management of a person's GI disease. The next D is digestion. And this can refer to both the objective process of digestion and absorption. So we're breaking down the chemicals in our food to the smallest parts and then absorbing those. And people might think, chemicals. I mean, chemicals, compounds, like anything is a chemical kind of way. So we're breaking down those macronutrients and we're absorbing what we can absorb. There are some compounds in our foods that we would call microbe accessible carbohydrates that resist our digestive enzymes, and they go on to the large intestine where they're metabolized by gut microbes. Now, that brings us to the subjective experience of digestion, which is how comfortable does it feel when you are digesting your food? Are you feeling a lot of gas and bloating? Or how are your bowel habits? Are you having pretty normal bowel movements? Or are you noticing that they're extremely loose or that you're experiencing constipation? So that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a disease of the GI tract, but it could be a symptom of disease of the GI tract. So our subjective experience and our objective ability to digest foods is very closely linked to the presence or absence of a GI disease. But we need to clarify that just because you have gas and bloating, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your GI tract. It is just a process that is associated with microbial metabolism. So it's normal for us to experience some gas and bloating. It really just comes down to the types of foods that we're eating. So that brings us to the third D, which is diversity. Now, diversity refers to the gut microbiome itself. The gut microbiome includes both the microbes themselves, we call them the microbiota. So those would be the bacteria, the fungi like yeasts, the archaea, which are similar to bacteria but still different, and even the viruses that inhabit our gastrointestinal tracts. And we may also have some parasites as well, depending on where we are in the world. So those are the microbes or the microbiota. When we say microbiome, we mean all of the microbes and their genetic material. So the microbiota, we talk about that in terms of taxonomic diversity. That's who's there. When we look at the genes, we talk about that in terms of functional diversity. What can they do? Now, early research focused a lot more on the taxonomic diversity of who's there because we didn't really have technology that was advanced enough to get a good look at all of the genes and the gene activity. We're starting to shift a little bit more to look at the functional diversity because it seems to be the case that it's actually more important to look at what the microbiome can do rather than just who's there. Now, I do have to point out that we don't have a gold standard a ratio of microbes that would indicate the right level of diversity. So diversity has a few different definitions, but in most cases, it just means the richness of species, so like the number of different species that we have, and then also the evenness or the proportions of those species. So it's it's relative because we're talking about proportions. We can look at absolute numbers and that might matter, but we also want to look at the proportions because that probably also matters. For example, we are inhabited by potential pathogens. So there are microbes that live in our guts as a natural, normal part of the community that could potentially cause disease. But they tend to behave well as long as the relative proportions of neutral or beneficial microbes outnumber the potential pathogens. But again, we don't have like a golden ratio where we say like it has to be a 4-to-1 of this type of microbe to this other type of microbe, because the microbes are also interacting with our genes and our immune system and our intestinal cells. So all of that comes together to influence the behavior of the microbiome. Now, there are some correlations or relationships between the level of diversity that someone might have in their gut or the proportions of microbes and whether or not they have a specific disease state and even the subjective experience of digestion, but we haven't established a cause and effect relationship between the microbiome and any aspect of disease or health. Because the microbiome is not just one unit, it's an entire ecosystem. And we either are going to have to redefine how we establish causation, or just settle for we probably will never be able to establish causation between a whole microbiome and an outcome. And we may need to focus on specific microbes of interest. And that's probably the direction that we're going to have to head, because we still really haven't established that for any native gut microbe and a specific disease outcome.
Okay, well, that was a very comprehensive answer. Thank you.
Of course.
So let me see if I got this straight. It sounds like everybody has a different ecosystem within themselves.
Yep, absolutely. It is as individual as a fingerprint.
Therefore, the approach to taking care of that microbiome also needs to be individualized. Is that right?
Absolutely. There are going to be some key fundamental approaches that could be universally applied, but when you get to the details of what those approaches actually look like, that's going to be very individualized.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. In fact, my next question was going to be, what are these general approaches that we could all benefit from? I personally call it good gut health hygiene practices.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. And these are going to be very unsexy, maybe like surprisingly so. So when we talk about probably what most people are concerned about are like, they say they want to have like good gut health. I think that they're usually thinking about their gut microbiome. Like, how can I support the diversity of my gut microbiome? How can I feel comfortable when I'm digesting food and eliminating waste? And how can I either prevent or manage a GI disease? So, starting with diversity, the most fundamental relationships that we have that we seem to see reproducibly would be that people who are eating a diverse and plant-centric diet does not have to be completely vegan or vegetarian, but it should be something that is widely based on produce, so fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, with a bias toward fish rather than red meat, and limiting things like refined carbohydrates, added sugars, and processed meats as well. So some example dietary patterns would be like the Mediterranean style diet or the DASH diet, the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. Those would be examples of dietary patterns that would provide a wide variety of microbe accessible carbohydrates. So basically, if you think of your microbiome as a zoo with a bunch of different animals in it, you have to have a diverse array of nutrients. Like, you're not going to feed the tigers the same stuff that you're going to feed the elephants or the ostriches. So it's the same concept there, providing a wide variety of nutrients for those microbes. We've also seen that there's a relationship between physical activity and microbial diversity, although again, we haven't established cause and effect, but it looks like it's probably a good idea to engage in physical activity regularly, especially aerobic activity. Just kind of meeting the World Health Organization recommendations, like 30 minutes a day, most days of the week, and then like do some resistance training. So we've got like eat a prudent diet, engage in regular physical activity. Another thing that would be really helpful is the prudent use of antibiotics. So a lot of people are concerned about antibiotic use. And yes, it is true that if you use an antibiotic, that is going to affect the gut microbiome. Now, that's not to say that we should avoid antibiotics in every case. You actually do need to use them as directed by your doctor, complete the entire prescription, because if you stop early, you could actually support the development of antimicrobial resistant genes, and that leads to superbugs that don't respond to antibiotics. Another thing that's important is to just think of like actual general hygiene. So one of the best ways that you could prevent yourself from getting sick is to wash your hands. So it's these really basic practices that can, help to support microbial diversity and also prevent the things that might like really knock it down for a little bit. If you do have to go on antibiotics and you experience something like antibiotic-associated diarrhea, that's where a probiotic could be applied. But if you're not experiencing that, you really just want to maintain your normal, prudent habits of that dietary pattern and physical activity. So those are the best things that we can say. Like, this is probably the big rocks for supporting diversity.
So
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, sorry. I was just going to make a quick recap to get everybody up to speed. You said a diverse plant-centric diet, based
Mhm.
on produce with a bias towards fish as opposed to
Mhm.
red meats.
Mhm.
Regular exercise, especially aerobic exercise, meeting WHO recommendations.
Mhm.
Proven and doctor-directed use of antibiotics.
Mhm.
And actual general hygiene, like washing your hands, is important to prevent
Exactly.
disease.
Yep, that's exactly it. Yes. So that's the diversity side of things. So then we can go into the disease aspect. I think that's the next that's a very a good segue into the next aspect. So when we want to talk about disease prevention, one of the most common preventable GI diseases that we're thinking of terms in like, longevity would be colorectal cancer. And so not only do those dietary patterns help to promote microbial diversity, they also can reduce the risk of developing colorectal cancer by an estimated 20%. So that's pretty significant,
Wow,
when you
yeah.
think those are some impressive numbers. So that would be one thing that we can kind of, apply in both directions, diversity and disease prevention, a prudent dietary pattern. If a person has inflammatory bowel disease, they're going to have to work with their gastroenterologist on pharmaceutical interventions to help control the immune system dysfunction that's causing the disease process. But again, it's following a prudent dietary pattern that's going to be helpful for ensuring that they're attaining adequate nutrients. Oh, sorry, my cat is shredding my sweater right now. He wants attention. Um, Unfortunately, there really aren't any proven dietary interventions that show that are strongly supported by evidence for causing remission in those diseases. So these are diseases that will go through flares or periods of high disease activity, and then they'll go into remission, low disease activity, and they'll do that naturally. Without any intervention at all. But the pharmaceutical methods are a way to maintain that remission. When it comes to dietary patterns, looks like the Mediterranean style dietary pattern is helpful. There's another dietary pattern called the specific carbohydrate diet, which is a little bit, it's very focused on like specific types of dietary carbohydrates, limiting refined sugars. That also seems to be probably just as helpful as the Mediterranean style diet, but a little bit harder to do because it's more restrictive. But overall, again, it's coming down to that prudent dietary pattern. When it comes to something like irritable bowel syndrome, things get a little bit more nuanced because that prudent dietary pattern could provide a lot of fermentable carbohydrates that we call FODMAPs. Now, FODMAPs are not bad, they're not harmful, they're just highly fermentable carbohydrates. So your gut microbes are feasting on those. It's like they are prebiotic. They're nutrients for all microbes, but they also support specifically those beneficial microbes. When a person with IBS eats FODMAPs, they quite often will subjectively experience elevated amounts of abdominal pain, bloating, and often objectively abnormal bowel habits. And this is especially the case with people who have diarrhea predominant IBS, not so much with people who have constipation predominant IBS. So in that case, they do still need to follow a prudent dietary pattern, but they may need to go through a systematic process of determining which of those highly fermentable carbohydrates are causing a lot of symptoms, and then just limit them and replace them with other sources of complex dietary carbohydrates that don't cause such discomfort. In both cases, there's again some utility of probiotics to alleviate some of the symptoms, not necessarily to really modify disease activity, but to perhaps alleviate some of the abdominal pain. And that's especially the case in IBS. If a person has constipation dominant IBS, there are some minor dietary modifications that seem to be helpful, like including psyllium husk as a supplement. So that's a type of fiber that helps to increase the frequency of bowel movements. And interestingly, there's been quite a bit of research, several studies on kiwis and their ability to ease constipation. And I've seen one study that was done in figs as well. So there are some foods that might cause a person with IBS-D to have uncomfortable loose bowel movements, but that could be helpful for a person with IBS-C because they actually do want to soften their bowel movements and make them easier to pass. So I think that kind of covers like disease prevention and disease management, really comes down to that prudent dietary pattern, working with your gastroenterologist because there are pharmaceutical interventions for both diseases that can help to ease those symptoms. And then just a very strain specific application of probiotics that have been shown to work for IBD or IBS. And then there are other gastrointestinal diseases as well that I haven't covered. I've just kind of talked about the two most common ones that we'll see in colorectal cancer. But the same advice would apply. Like, we want to ensure that we're eating as diverse a diet as possible and making sure that it's very prudent and that we are using what resources we have to manage those symptoms.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining. I just have a quick question
Mhm.
because when you were talking about the potential usefulness of probiotics, you mentioned that you basically said these are potentially useful in IBS, but
Mhm.
for constipation dominant IBS. So I was wondering, did you mean for that probiotics are particularly useful for diarrhea dominant IBS? And then for constipation dominant IBS, it's a little bit different. I'm not quite sure the wording was clear there, or at least
Oh,
for me.
sure. Yeah, yeah. So I think I spoke about FODMAPs in that way and then also probiotics.
Yes.
So, yeah, so the FODMAP, the fermentable carbohydrate that causes a person with IBS-D to have worsening diarrhea, could actually be helpful for a person with IBS-C
Oh, I see.
because yeah, so it's pulling that water into the intestines and that can actually ease transit. Now, with
Yes.
probiotic applications, I mentioned being strain specific. So, a strain is a subspecies. So, when we look at the taxonomic organization of microbes, that basically is organizing them by their genetic similarity. And in many cases, when we talk about a species, when it comes to like animal species, we have a very specific definition of what a species is. It's not the same with microbes, so it's a little bit of a cloudier definition. But just to give an example, that there are strains of E. coli that are probiotic, and there are strains of E. coli that can cause disease. So there
Mm.
are strains of lactobacillus or bifidobacteria that would work for pediatric diarrhea that wouldn't necessarily work for adult diarrhea. So being strain specific essentially means to use the strain of probiotic bacteria that has been shown to work for that specific ailment. So, for example, S. boulardii is a yeast that's been shown to be, and it's S. boulardii ilio, I want to say, the specific strain, and that's been shown to be effective for traveler's diarrhea and antibiotic associated diarrhea. And then there is L. rhamnosus GG, which has been shown to be really helpful in pediatric diarrhea, but not so much for adult diarrhea. So you just want to make sure that if you're going to invest your money in something like that, you're getting the right microbe for the job. Now, we don't have consensus on the best dose or the best duration or the best timing because so many of these probiotic studies are done in different ways, so different methodology. That means you can't really compile the data. But recent meta-analyses have shown that people probably get maximum benefit somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks of probiotic supplementation. And then after that, the benefits recede or are completely absent. And they've also seen that that is associated with a person's microbiome rebounding to its pre probiotic state, regardless of the continued supplementation of probiotics. So that lends credence to the idea that our microbiomes are extremely resilient. So they bounce back after challenges. And that makes sense when we're thinking about like an ecosystem's ability to maintain homeostasis in general through allostasis. So that's kind of like all the fluctuations that we need to maintain somewhere around a baseline state of functionality. So the microbiome is very unlikely to collapse, despite what you might see on Instagram, people saying like everything destroys your gut microbiome. Probably not. I've yet to see any evidence that even after something like antibiotics, a person's microbiome just is completely obliterated and is no longer present or functional at all.
That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that, particularly on probiotics and who they might be useful for.
Of course, of course.
So I think the last point then that you mentioned at the beginning was how can one feel comfortable when digesting? And that's something that people look into in terms of good gut health hygiene practices.
Absolutely. So the third D, the digestion. So we have the objective process of digestion, and that is breaking our macronutrients down into the smallest possible parts. Now, that is done both mechanically through the contractions of our gastrointestinal tract and chemically through our digestive enzymes. So, both of those processes, as I mentioned, can be affected by the presence of a disease because we could either have abnormal contractions. So the food isn't moving in one direction. We've got an entrance door and we've got an exit door. And so we want the food to be moving along kind of in the way that you squeeze a toothpaste tube from the bottom to the top. Hopefully, unless you're one of those heathens that squeezes it from the middle. And what are you doing? Um, but that's a really good analogy for like if we do have abnormal contractions and we could have some retrograde or backwards flow of intestinal contents, that could put a person at an increased risk of developing small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So that's where we see abnormally high numbers of microbes in the small intestine, especially represented by microbes that really should only be in the large intestine. So those are the microbes that usually are our big fermenters. They are obligate, or I should say, some of them would be what we call like facultative anaerobes. So they can like kind of hang out in higher or lower oxygen environments, and they can produce a lot of gas. And so, because we have this abnormal population in the small intestine, then the subjective experience of digestion is affected because we perceive so much distension, abdominal pain, and that could be objectively occurring too, that we have an abnormal amount of gas production. And that's part of the way that we test for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is to look at the amount and ratios of gases that a person is expelling in their breath, because we know that certain gases are only going to come from the intestinal microbes. So that's what could happen if we have the abnormal muscular contraction. Now, if we are lacking a digestive enzyme, we'll also have pretty severe GI distress. One of the most common examples is lactase deficiency, and that leads to lactose intolerance. So, lactose is a sugar that's found in many different types of dairy, and it's actually pretty normal for most adults to develop lactose intolerance because they start producing less and less of the lactase enzyme over time. So if you don't have the lactase enzyme, that means that sugar is left available for the microbes. And when they metabolize it, that's when we get a lot of gas and bloating. And that sugar can also pull a lot of water into the intestines, and then we'll have loose bowel movements. There are much rarer forms of enzyme deficiencies like sucrase deficiency, and that's where we can't break down sucrose. And that will also manifest with really severe GI distress, a lot of loose bowel movements. A person may also have exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, so the pancreas isn't producing the normal digestive enzymes, and they're going to have GI distress as well. Those are really, really uncommon. Now, if a person has one of these enzyme deficiencies, especially one of the rarer ones, there are pharmaceutical grade digestive enzymes that offer some relief, but still they're not 100%. And the same thing can be said for those over the counter digestive enzymes, that they may offer some relief in certain people, but they are not 100% effective. So it's not like you can, if you have lactose intolerance, like, do the gallon of milk a day diet, and then like take some lactase pills. You're probably still gonna have some discomfort. So that's what can happen if we have an enzyme deficiency. Now, there are compounds that we'll get in our foods, those microbe accessible carbohydrates. So those are like our dietary fibers and the FODMAPs that we do not produce digestive enzymes for. So there's no human that can break down the galactosidase. No, that's our enzyme. There's no person that produces galactosidase, beta galactosidase, I want to say. That's what's sold in Beano. And so it's not that there is some dysfunction, it's just that you as a human have not evolved to break down those specific compounds. And those are going to be the ones that travel to our large intestine where they're metabolized by gut microbes. And that again can lead to things like gas and bloating. So that can affect our subjective experience of digestion. And that's where really we want to either, do a systematic elimination reintroduction, like via the low FODMAP process, or just like if we have one food or one group of foods that we think is like a really obvious culprit, we might eliminate that for a few days, see how we feel, and reintroduce it, and then see how we feel, and just do a dietary modification in that way. There are very few probiotics that seem to be helpful for people without any disease at all. Like if you don't have IBS, you don't have IBD, or some sort of infectious diarrhea, you're just like a normal, healthy person, then it looks like a lot of times probiotics don't actually do anything at all. So they probably won't be super effective if your issue just comes down to like, I have lactose intolerance, or I'm eating a lot of beans lately, or I just switched. I used to eat a lot of fast food and refined carbohydrates, and I've just totally revamped my diet, and now I'm getting so much more fiber. Even that can cause GI distress. And that can be within the normal, like a recommended range of fiber. So if you're going from maybe 15 grams to 19 grams of fiber per day, which is about what we average in the United States, and then all of a sudden you're like, New Year's, plant-based diet, and then you go up to like 25 or 30 grams of fiber a day, you could get some GI distress from that. But when we look at studies in populations where people have these really like phasic diets where they go from very low fiber to high fiber because of what's available to them, they find that it usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks to adapt to the higher fiber levels. And another thing you can do is just to increase your fiber intake slowly. So about 3 grams per day each week. So if you're starting at, 15 this week, you're going to go up to 18. And then next week you could go up to 21. And then the next week to 24. So just doing that more gradually. So you're not suddenly giving your microbes like a whole smorgasbord, and then they're creating tons and tons of gas, and you haven't adapted to that yet.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining that. A question on fiber then. Is increasing it by 3 grams a day, week on week, or going gung-ho and literally going from 15, 19 to 25, the same, as long as, let's say that you decide, okay, I just want to increase it all at once, I'm going to cope with the potential side effects for 2 to 3 weeks until I'm adapted to it. Would that be essentially the same in terms of benefits as doing it more gradually, except, you might get a bit more GI distress, or is there a better way of doing it between the two?
No, those would be equivalent. It really just comes down to like what's sustainable for a person. If they're like, "Oh, I can handle some gas and bloating," but then they're like, "Oh, wow, no, I can't." It was way worse than I thought. Then I would say, err on the side of what is going to bring you to that goal in a way that suits you best. And some people might be able to increase their fiber intake appreciably and not have any GI distress. So again, it really comes down to your unique microbiome and the way that those microbes are interacting with nutrients, with each other, with your intestinal tract, and also your personal gut-brain connection that leads you to perceive the presence or absence of GI distress. One thing that I didn't address that I want to now, because I just reminded myself of it, that could also aid in the subjective experience of digestion. And this is based on research in people with IBS. So it's really interesting to consider the role of the gut-brain axis and just our more advanced, more modern areas of our brain that allow us to perceive and then like judge a sensation as like, oh, this is bad, this is good. So in people with IBS, there have been a couple interesting interventions. One is the use of hypnotherapy or the use of cognitive behavioral therapy. Both of those seem effective for helping people to perceive lower symptom severity or just improve quality of life, even though there was no perceivable impact on the actual disease activity. Like we didn't change the gut microbiome necessarily. The GI tract could still be dysfunctional, but we either have changed the way that we interpret those signals from the gut, or perhaps we have actually, through the reduction of anxiety and stress, actually reduced some of the abnormal contractions of the gut. So we've seen that with the hypnotherapy and CBT. Another really interesting study looked at the role of the placebo effect. Now, what I love about this is that the intervention was either a blinded placebo. So that means they told these people, okay, you might be getting peppermint oil, because that is shown to reduce abdominal pain, or you might be getting a placebo, but you don't know which one. And then there was another group that was told, you are getting a placebo. Now, both groups actually got placebos. So, like, it was just whether you're getting a blinded placebo or a known placebo. And both groups improved. So, like, whether even when someone tells you this is a placebo, sometimes placebos help people feel better. And you take the placebo pill, you will potentially still feel better. And that again lends credence to the idea that it could be, in part, what we anticipate to feel. So if I eat a food and I think, oh my gosh, I'm gonna feel so terrible when I eat this, that alone could contribute to how poorly you feel after eating that food. Whereas if you go into it saying, sometimes this food makes me feel kind of crummy, but I can anticipate how that's going to feel. I know that I can be prepared with like my peppermint oil pills, a heating pad. I'm going to do some deep breathing. We go into that situation with potentially like lower stress and anxiety, we may have fewer GI symptoms. And while we haven't established a cause and effect relationship between psychological stress and GI symptoms, there is a correlation. So a lot of people report that when they are really stressed out, that's when their GI symptoms are the worst. And that can be in people with IBS, or people who have no known disease. Like you're super anxious and stressed. You get like the stress poops, and then it's kind of like, why is this happening? Nothing else has changed, but it's that psychological impact and the role of the gut brain axis that we're still learning a lot about, but it does seem like there's an important link there.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and it's very fascinating research, actually, especially the relationship between the gut and the brain. I've heard people state that the gut is like a second brain, which I found to be quite an interesting statement to make. So thank you for explaining a little bit about that. Now, if I were to make a very, very quick, bare bone summary, I would say that it sounds like that these good gut health hygiene practices come down to a plant-centric, nutrient-dense diet, regular exercise, and stress management.
Yeah, exactly. And then just like basic hygiene.
Basic hygiene like washing your hands.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yep.
Well, that is really great to hear, to be honest, because yes, you said it's not very sexy and perhaps unexpectedly so, but it also saves people a lot of mental fatigue trying to decipher what's true and what isn't true, and also a lot of money often, because if you, as you said, if you don't have any disease that's been proven, then why are you buying probiotics if, as you just said, they potentially don't have any effect at all?
That's exactly it. Yeah. And there are a lot of influencers and marketers out there that are trying to sell us a problem so that we'll buy their solution. And like those problems are often either really grossly inflated or they're just complete pseudoscience.
And that's a fantastic segue because my next question was going to be, as we established at the beginning, neither of us is into calling out anyone in particular. So that's not what I'm asking here. But nowadays, most of us get information from social media in one way or another. And there are a lot of so-called gut health experts, some of them real, like you, and some less reputable. And it's very hard to tell who's um, reputable and who isn't. So if you were to give advice to somebody who doesn't have your background, doesn't have your knowledge, just a standard person walking on the street, on how to tell quackery from truth, what would you tell them?
Oh, I love this question because I've created this list of red flags over time as I've seen, more and more examples. I would say one of the biggest red flags for pseudoscience is if the person uses the word causes or root cause. And quite often it will show up like dysbiosis causes X, Y, and Z. Leaky gut causes X, Y, and Z. Bad gut health causes X, Y, and Z. We know that we haven't established a cause and effect relationship between the gut microbiome and anything. And the term dysbiosis is a very poorly defined sort of scapegoat that's even used in the research world. And we can talk about all of the problems with the concept of dysbiosis, but that's another term. It's very ambiguous. And the same thing for leaky gut, that also, although intestinal permeability is a real thing and is associated with certain disease states, we haven't established that as a cause of anything. This segues into the next red flag, which is claims that they can diagnose, treat, or cure dysbiosis, leaky gut, or bad gut health. None of those things are diseases to be diagnosed or treated or cured. So that's another big red flag. A third that is similar would be selling something like a gut reset. So is definitely credence to sometimes doing no oral food intake for someone with a severe GI disease that might be hospitalized. That's not the same thing as a gut reset. So usually gut resets are sold as the idea that bad, quote unquote, bad bacteria will be eliminated or the GI tract will be healed. That's also it's just pseudoscience. Not only do we not have a clear delineation between good and bad gut microbes, they behave a certain way in context. What are we healing if there's nothing wrong with the tissues of the GI tract? And what exactly is being reset? Because we're talking about an entire organ system that houses an entire ecosystem. So what is being reset? So I would say those are the biggest three, would be saying, one of these things is a root cause. They can be diagnosed, treated, or cured, that you have good or bad gut health, or that you need a gut reset. So those are all very pseudoscientific, and they can show up in a lot of different ways. But if you know about those, you can usually go from there and say like, oh, okay, well, this person's talking about something like a food sensitivity test or GI map, but they're also saying things like dysbiosis causes X, Y, and Z. If they're saying that, then it absolutely casts a huge shadow of doubt on anything else that they're saying.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining that.
Mm-hmm.
So that is actually very comprehensive. It covers a lot of other questions that I had in mind. One that maybe we haven't touched upon is this. So there are a lot of tests that are purported to help and better understand the state of your gut microbiome. Are there any that are evidence-based and actually worth, well, if somebody suggests them to you, you can say, okay, this makes sense, or are they all quackery, essentially?
So I love the way that you said the state of your gut microbiome, because that sets the stage for another kind of nuanced answer. So the tests that are available now can tell you the objective state of your gut microbiome in terms of the taxonomy, or I should say your fecal microbiome. So the microbes that are in your fecal sample. You will be able to see who's there, the taxonomy, and in some cases what they're doing depends on the company. They may also send you what gene, like some select gene activity. So you are seeing a snapshot of the state of your fecal sample in that moment. What you are not getting, although this is being sold to you, is some clinically relevant evidence that you should be eating in a certain way or that you have dysbiosis. So the snapshot that you're getting reflects the fecal microbes, which are actually going to be different from your gastrointestinal tract microbes. And they're going to be influenced by the last 24 hours of your dietary and mostly of your dietary habits. But also just the fact that you're human, you're a specific gender assigned at birth. I don't know like how that would change with any other sort of interventions, and that you are in a specific geographic location. And like those are some of the biggest factors and you can't change like where you were born. You can't change that you're a human. And it's like that's probably 2/3 of our core microbiome is just anyone who gets the test is going to have those things in common. Maybe one third is influenced by your dietary and physical activity habits. And we've seen that dietary practices can influence the composition of the microbiome within 24 hours. So, how is it that we can interpret this one fecal sample, which is different from your gastrointestinal tract, and say, oh, this now informs like the health of your gut microbiome and what you should be eating? But there are companies that sell that. And they've done that by drawing correlations between a person's dietary habits and their gut microbes. But these are very weak correlations, like they might explain 20% of the variance. And and if we were to apply that in other directions, like when we talk about this, we say like an R squared of like zero point 0.2, a very, very weak correlation. In a lot of other places, is that if I were to say like, oh, well, this one exercise, like doing squats on a Bosu ball, seemed to have like a weak correlation with squat improvements, people would be like, that's actually not really a relationship. Like we can hardly say, that might be just a coincidence. But because it is scientific, like we're using valid statistical tests, we're using uh, methods that we would use in a research lab, like looking at 16S RNA or metagenomic shotgun sequencing, that there is this modicum of science to it, that you are looking at the state of your microbiome, but it's the interpretation that's a real problem. And one of the most problematic interpretations is the assignment of dysbiosis to a person. So if you and I were to compare our fecal samples,
Oh,
they would.
interesting.
Yes. So this is an N of 2 experiment. So, and like, I'm sure we might engage in like similar physical activity habits. Maybe we eat a similar dietary pattern. So where were you born, for example?
I was born in Italy.
Okay, so you were born in Italy. I was born in Germany, and then I moved to the US at 3. Who knows what my microbiome did after that? And then you came to the US. So our geographic origins would have a really big impact on our microbiome. And then our dietary practices, and then our age. I won't ask you that, but like, if we're a decade apart in age or something like that, which I don't think we are. But so all of those things are going to influence the composition of our microbiome. And then what we've been eating for the last 24 hours as well. So in this, so imagine that a company has recruited us or has recruited you. They've recruited you to be one of their healthy samples. You don't have a GI disease. So they say, okay, we're going to collect your fecal sample and the fecal sample of other people, maybe like 35, maybe even 300 people. And we're going to say that the average composition of your gut microbiome, you're all healthy. So you have the healthy GI, you have the healthy microbiome index. And then we're going to have another group of people who have maybe IBS or IBD. And we're going to say their average microbiome composition, that's dysbiosis. Now I come in, I don't necessarily have, I don't have IBS, but imagine that I am more similar to the diseased group because of my geographic location, my age, my gender, my dietary patterns. I'm going to be assigned potentially as having dysbiosis just because I'm very different from you and maybe more similar to the group with IBS. But it could happen that there is no IBS group. It's just you and I being compared. And like you had your sample done first, you're the control group, and I was compared to you, and I was very different, then I have dysbiosis. So the question is like, which one of us has dysbiosis if both of us are healthy, but you just happen to be in the reference group of control healthy people to which I was compared? But the reason that we're different is not that there's something wrong with my microbiome. It's just that we are different human beings that were born in different places and we're at different life stages with different dietary patterns. Like I could be vegetarian, you could be vegan. Both of those are associated with microbial diversity and colorectal cancer prevention. Does that mean that like if we're different, one of us has dysbiosis? That comes to the problem with the definition of dysbiosis, is that it really just means any difference compared to the control group, but we have attached a really a negative connotation to that. There's like this stigma that, oh, different, that must mean bad. And that actually traces back to ancient Greek beliefs about imbalances in the humors of the body, and that physicians used to balance the humors. So we still have sort of this internalized value system around things being balanced. People balance your hormones, balance your microbiome. But balance is poorly defined and completely subjective and also relative. So when we talk about the concept of dysbiosis, even in the research world, it's a huge problem. Like, when you have a study or a research group that puts out a publication and they're like, oh, it must be dysbiosis. There's a really great, unfortunately, it's not open access, but there's a really great piece by Olison. It came out in, I think, 2016, entitled Dysbiosis is Not an Answer. And he points out that really it's a scapegoat mechanism free definition or a term that we can use to explain any finding. And also, if we assume that a person with a disease state has dysbiosis, then any microbiome sample that we get from a person with a disease state has dysbiosis, because we've already assumed that. We've already assumed that there's a problem there. And really, it could be that that person has the best possible microbiome that they could have given their disease state. And it is going to look different from another person's, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with it or that it has caused the disease progression. It could be that the disease progression has somehow influenced the microbiome. So I find these tests so frustrating because they can be really misleading and cause a lot of anxiety, and they're very expensive for the information that they're providing, which is essentially just like, here's a snapshot of what's going on in your poop today based on the last 24 hours.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining. So it sounds like any test that postulates to diagnose good or bad gut health or that dysbiosis is not a test to be trusted.
Absolutely. And especially when they're making specific recommendations about foods that you should be eating, like, oh, you have this microbe in your stool sample, so you should be eating raspberries. We are not there yet. Like, there's very, very weak associations. And it's great if you want to eat raspberries, but like, you could also eat blueberries or strawberries, and you're going to get the benefits of eating fruit, of eating berries.
That makes sense. You did mention throughout our conversation some tests that are used to diagnose, for example, SIBO. You mentioned a breath test. So it sounds like there are some that are actually evidence-based. Can you tell us which ones they are, so that when the listeners are presented with them by a healthcare provider, they know that they can trust that healthcare provider?
Yes. So if you're going to a gastroenterologist or a GP, they're going to be ordering clinically valid relevant tests for you. So it could be a breath test. Quite often they might want to do some scopes. So they might do something like a colonoscopy or an upper endoscopy if they want to look at your stomach. They could do a colonoscopy to look at your colon. There are actually really these amazing little pill cameras that you can swallow, and then they can visualize the entire GI tract, what I think is so cool. And it just sends the pictures. It's like taking pictures every, half a second.
That's amazing. It's like sending a spaceship to Mars to take picture of the planet.
Yes, yeah. Like, I don't know if people remember the show The Magic School Bus, but they could like shrink the school bus down.
Yes.
And, like, that's exactly it. So we have reached that place in science. So they will want to do imaging of the intestines in some cases. And then they may also take fecal samples. And so there are valid clinically relevant tests that can identify the presence of infectious microbes like Giardia or C. difficile. And when they look at those, along with your symptoms and the presence of specific toxins, then they could diagnose you with, oh, you have an infectious disease. They may also look for the presence of H. pylori, which is linked to gastritis and less strongly linked to peptic ulcers and gastric ulcers. But the presence, again, of something like C. diff or H. pylori doesn't necessarily mean that you have an active infection with that microbe. And about 50% of people are colonized by H. pylori, but a lot of them won't actually have any symptoms or any issues with it. It's just happily living its little microbial life, behaving in the context of your microbiome. So those are some of the most common basic tests to rule out the presence of an organic disease. If your intestinal tract looks normal, but you still have a lot of symptoms in terms of abnormal bowel habits, then you might receive a diagnosis of something like irritable bowel syndrome. But in most cases, if you're going into the alternative medicine world, like the complementary and alternative medicine world, which does provide plenty of evidence-based interventions, that's where you're more likely to run into pseudoscientific diagnoses and tests. So that's where you might see something like an IgG food sensitivity test, a comprehensive stool analysis test, or they might do some other, like, there are, maybe they'll come up with some sort of pseudoscientific tests to look for candida overgrowth. So they'll ask you, do you feel brain fog? Do you ever have acne? Things like that. That, like, we don't we don't have one single cause for. And also, candida overgrowth is another one of those, like, pseudoscientific diagnoses that you can have high levels of candida in the intestinal tract, but in most cases, we're seeing that in premature babies and people who are immunosuppressed, and just the presence of the candida doesn't actually indicate any infection. And in a healthy person, you're just not going to be at risk for that disease. And so if a person's telling you, oh, another red flag is if they're telling you to go on some, like, super, super restrictive diet, like don't eat any sugar, or that's kind of one of the most common ones, like cut out all sugar. But then you're eating something like maple syrup or honey instead, which is the same thing. So another, like, kind of just like the demonizing or moralizing certain foods or certain food groups. Those are going to be other red flags that, like, maybe this person is going to recommend interventions that are, and tests that are not evidence-based.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. That covers absolutely everything that I could think of about gut health. And I think this episode is going to be a fantastic gut health primer for all of my listeners. Before we close this episode out, is there anything that you would want to go into in a bit more detail that maybe you talked about, but you then thought, oh, I wish I said that, or maybe something we haven't touched upon at all that you want to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, I think I would just emphasize that I understand how it can be super frustrating when you have severe GI distress and maybe you've gone to a gastroenterologist or a GP who may have been a little too dismissive or quick with you, and maybe they put you through a litany of tests and you've come away with either a clean bill of health or a diagnosis of IBS. So diagnosis of IBS is not a non-diagnosis, and it's not just oh, we don't know what else it is, so here you have IBS. There are still diagnostic criteria for IBS. So that is all really frustrating, and it is totally valid to get a second opinion from another GP. What I would really caution people against is to go to those more extreme measures of, like, a cleanse or a reset or doing all of the invalid testing, because that is just going to spend more of your money and waste more of your time. If you have a clean bill of health, that is fantastic. And that means that probably your next step is going to be some form of dietary intervention or testing for something that could be really rare. Like maybe you have one of those enzyme deficiencies and you need to dig a little bit deeper, but still stay on track with the clinically valid, relevant tests, because that's going to give you the most useful information and keep you informed so that you can make choices in your own best interest, and to trust that, like, if you have a clean bill of health or you have IBS, that there are interventions and you don't have to go down the route of using those tests that are really not going to be helpful for you, even though they might provide information. More information doesn't mean useful information.
Thank you, Gabrielle. You heard it here first, people. Don't fall for the quackery. Even when you're at the bottom, at the end of your rope, don't do that, because it's not going to help, unfortunately.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. Thank you very much, Gabrielle. Now, before we go, please take your time to plug anything you like, anywhere you want to direct the listeners to. If they want to connect with you, work with you, it's your time to do that.
Oh, thank you. So people can find me on Instagram at Vitamin PhD. And they can also check out my website, vitaminphdnutrition.com. So I do work again to provide consultations so that people can make informed decisions. I mentor coaches who want to provide evidence-based gut health coaching. And I also have available 10 episodes of my Gut Health with Gab webinar series that people can purchase to watch either one episode they might find interesting on gluten-related diseases, for example, or they can get the whole series. So they can hear from me and then registered dietitians who specialize in this area talk about the science and even the ethics of the gut microbiome and gut health.
Perfect. I'll make sure to add all of these links in the show notes. Again, thank you for being here with me today, Gabrielle. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you for your time today. I hope that you learned as much as I did from this interview. If you want to connect with me or with Dr. Fundaro, or if you want to work with either of us or both of us, you'll find all the links to do so in the show notes. As a side note, I just want to make a clarification. Dr. Fundaro mentioned that I came to the US during our conversation, so I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows I am still based in Liverpool, UK. I do not reside in the US. It really doesn't matter because you can work with me wherever you are in the world since I provide online coaching. However, some of the more attentive listeners might have picked up on that part of the conversation and got confused. So I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page. Thanks again for listening, and until next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.